started?
You're ready.
Okay, great. Hello, my name is Audrey Berner. I work at the Eau Claire City County Health Department. I'm a public health specialist there, but my background is in groundwater geology and was a groundwater geologist in Nebraska in my previous life. So I was part of the staff that was supporting the County Groundwater Advisory Committee in their effort this year to update our groundwater report for the county. So in 1994, the Groundwater Advisory Committee for the county undertook a project to put together a state of groundwater report. And this year we decided, well, it's almost 25 years old, maybe it's time to update the darn thing. So the advisory committee took that on, and then we had several staff members from the health department, from DNR, from land conservation, and others who contributed to that process. Regional planning, West Central Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission was also part of that process. So I'm just going to go through an outline of what that report looks like, and at the end, it is available online on the county website. At the end, I talk a little bit about how to access that if you would like to see some more of the figures or read up more on that detail of the groundwater report. So, next one. There we go. So just an overview of what I'll touch on. I'll just talk a little bit about some general information. I know a lot of folks in the room are very familiar with groundwater. Some are maybe a little less familiar. So I'll just talk through some basic principles for groundwater, and specifically groundwater in Eau Claire County, before touching on some of the specific trends in land use, in water testing, in groundwater quality, quantity, and then eventually get to some recommendations that came out of that report. So just some general information on the kind of the very highest level. As a county, we actually have a high volume of good quality groundwater. So sort of like our general statement about groundwater is it's pretty good here. We're in a pretty good position here. When we consider what Eau Claire County needs to protect groundwater, it's important to remember that what our geology and what our subsurface is like is not the same as other parts of the state or other parts of neighboring states as well. So we have to keep in mind that we have a different type of subsurface than what they have even in La Crosse, certainly in the eastern part of the state, Madison, northern Wisconsin. We look a little bit different because of the history and because of the glaciers that were in this part of the state, and in history that even predates that. So just to keep that in mind, that we're a little bit different than other parts of the state when it comes to what kind of groundwater and how it occurs here. In general, though, our aquifers are made of sandstone. I'm sure most, if not everyone's pretty familiar with that. So that means that the picture that's on the right there of the gravel, that our water is present in between those round sand grains rather than in fractures, which is what you see on the left. Fractured, kind of groundwater occurring in fractures is what we think of more commonly in the southern part of the state. La Crosse, kind of if you make a U shape or a horseshoe from La Crosse down to the southern part of the state and then up to Green Bay and Door County. So very different type of occurrence of groundwater from us compared to other parts of the state because of that. Because we have the sand aquifer, it's easy for groundwater to get pulled out of the subsurface with wells. It's also pretty easy to recharge that groundwater or get infiltration in through the surface from rainwater or from irrigation and things like that. And it's also important to remember, and as the diagram shows, that groundwater and surface water are connected. So when we add or subtract from one, that can add or subtract from the other one. And if you think about it, we've had a pretty mild winter. Even a very cold winter though, there are some streams that run all winter long. That's because they're fed by groundwater, and groundwater stays at about 55 degrees year round. So when you have groundwater feeding some of those streams, they're never gonna freeze because they're always at about 20 degrees above freezing, give or take a little bit. So that natural flow rate of groundwater through sandstone, how fast is the groundwater moving? It's variable depending on where you are in the county, but generally it's a few inches to a few feet per day. So just kind of vertical or lateral movement in the subsurface, sometimes less. So again, it really depends on where you are in the county. So some more general information about use then. So groundwater is really most of the water that we use in this county. We really don't use surface water as kind of a consumption. for a very high percentage at all. So about 94% of the water that we use is groundwater for domestic, for commercial use, for industrial use, for agricultural use. So public and private drinking water all fall into that category. It comes from a mix of very deep, very old, and when I say very old, think hundreds of millions of years old aquifers, and then also some shallower sand and gravel aquifers, so some areas that are closer to the surface. So we have a mix of water that's closer to the surface and some that's much deeper as well. And because these aquifers are sandy, it's easy to get water out, as I said. So a lot of them can easily produce 500 to 1,000 gallons per minute of water if you have a high enough capacity well. You can get out quite a lot of water in a short amount of time. So overall, our groundwater use in the county is estimated per year to be between 6 and 7.5 billion gallons. That includes about 9,000 private wells that we have in the county, which is about a daily consumption rate per person of about 47 gallons per day. So it might not be your household rate, but if you average out from all the commercial and industrial and other uses that happen in the county, that's about our average per person. And that's actually gone down in the last 25 to 30 years, it's gone down by about 15 gallons per day. So overall, we're using less water than we did 25 to 30 years ago. So land use trends. So this is a really important part for estimating understanding how we use groundwater now, and then estimating how we'll use groundwater in the future as well. And there's lots of factors. You know, our land use on the surface obviously impacts how much groundwater is going to be used, but also how susceptible that groundwater might be to contamination as well. So we really need to know what's going on the surface. And there's lots of different things that can impact, you know, two of the same uses, but in different parts of the county can impact groundwater differently depending on how deep that groundwater is, what type of rock is there, what type of soil is there, and how deep the bedrock is where that groundwater is coming from as well. So there's lots of different land uses, or lots of different ways that land use can impact groundwater, but all land uses have an impact on groundwater one way or another. The actual aquifer materials also are important. So if you have a lot of fine grains like silt and clay, those tend to slow water down, obviously. If you have more sand and gravel, that will speed up the travel of water and anything that might contaminate water as well. So understanding what those actual aquifer materials are is really important to understanding how we can or need to be able to protect our groundwater in certain parts of the county. Forest and agricultural land, so how does that show up? And, okay, that shows up pretty well. So green and yellow are forest and agricultural land on the map respectively. So those are obviously our two biggest land uses that we have here in the county. Residential land, which shows up, well, you can't, that's not really broken out in here. But residential land is also part of our land use obviously as well, not only within the cities, but within subdivisions. Our population is projected to grow by about 10,000 people in the next 20 years or so, which is estimated to be a 2 to 4% increase in groundwater needs. And residential land use, just like every other land use, does have an impact on groundwater, whether it's from failing septic systems or improper disposal of household chemicals or lawn fertilizer applications, or teaching your kid how to change the oil in a car and that goes really, really badly. You know, there's lots of different ways that those land uses can impact our groundwater. And then the last thing is commercial land use. So that's a relatively small part of our county land use. It's just about 2%. But again, that would be things like parking lots. So parking lots impacts how infiltration happens on the surface there. Roofs, you know, also obviously impacts infiltration rates. And then some commercial areas also use large amounts of groundwater, such as for paper production or mining, or in other counties, cranberries and things like that. So talking more specifically about groundwater quality now, this is a map of nitrate results from the health department database. Again, overall, groundwater quality is not too bad here in Eau Claire County. Certainly room for improvement, but certainly there are other parts of the state that have some more issues than what we do. So generally, pH, which is a measure of how acidic or basic the water is, and hardness, which is how much calcium and magnesium we've got dissolved in the groundwater, are not concerns county-wide. They're pretty acceptable county-wide. And those are usually reflective of just naturally occurring conditions and how the water is interacting with the rock. So as far as human influence components, that's where nitrate is one of those very commonly sampled components for kind of how are humans influencing groundwater. So sources can of course include agriculture, but also lawn fertilizers and also septic systems. So there's lots of different sources of nitrogen to groundwater. And from the nitrate samples that we have in the health department database, so we have about, I think it doesn't say the years on there. This shows several years of data that we've done at the health department. So obviously, I think most folks are familiar, the MCL, or the maximum contaminant level. So the level at which we start to ask pregnant women and infants to not drink the water is 10 parts per million of nitrate. But we expect nitrate to be occurring at around 2 parts per million, just because of the nitrogen cycle is a natural cycle in the subsurface. So we do expect some nitrogen to be present in groundwater regardless. So when I say 57% are above natural levels, what that means is that just a little over half of the samples that we've analyzed are above that 2 parts per million. So it's giving us an indication that there's something here is going on. We don't know what exactly is making nitrate a little higher than what we'd expect, but somehow humans are influencing that groundwater that we're seeing nitrate a little bit higher. About 6% of the samples then that we've analyzed have exceeded that health standard, which is that 10 parts per million, where again we advise pregnant women and infants not to drink that water.
About how many wells?
There's about 9,000 wells in the county.
That you tested that water.
Oh, about 4,500 we've tested. So we've got tests from about half of them. Yeah. About 10 years or so. We don't have some folks have gotten multiple tests from the same address, so we don't have an exact number, but it'd be in about the last 10 to 12 years of data that we've got 4,500 unique addresses.
Does each one of those red dots represent just one well, or is it more than one well?
It represents one well, but for how far we're zoomed out here, there could be multiple red dots next to each other that you just can't see how close they are together. Yeah. So that especially just south of the city of Eau Claire, there you can see there's a lot bunched up. There could be even other dots that are like hiding under those, just because of how big I made them, so you could see the map. So it's not a great representation on the map, but the best we can do without zooming in closer to some of those areas. Absolutely. Yeah, so we recommend that folks get their private wells tested once a year for nitrate and bacteria, and I'll talk about bacteria next. Each of those tests, what was the current rate, Matt? Is it $18 to test? $21. Okay, new fee scale for the year. So it's $21 a test. We do have several campaigns throughout the year where we have offered discounted testing or encouraged testing if there's been high water events and wells are potentially have been flooded and could be contaminated for that reason as well. We do offer free testing to families with a newborn that are on a private well throughout the county as well. Kate.
So I have a couple things to say. There was actually just legislation proposed to the state legislature to speak to for a free well testing program. So it's something that we happen hopefully. So that
I hadn't heard about that.
Yeah, I just saw it in the news yesterday. So hopefully that'll come to fruition so that everyone can have more of an incentive or less of a disincentive to get their well tested. I was also wondering if you have an idea of kind of the rate at which wells are polluted. So could there be, even if somebody's tested regularly within a year, could there be an event of high nitrates that like come and goes in between those testing periods?
Yeah, so I'll have to give the famous answer, it depends. Certainly if you've just applied fertilizer, let's say, to your lawn, and there's it's been sort of a saturated season and there's a lot of rain, you could get a bit of a flushing of that. And we do see sometimes some spring flushing just because things are melting, we have more runoff, and we can see higher nitrate and bacteria in the spring in some wells, but it's not consistent. So I wouldn't say that there's a pattern that you can subscribe to, but it is possible when you have some of those recharge events that you could see higher levels at those times.
And if I may add, it would also depend upon how deep are you drawing the water from.
Absolutely.
Closer to the surface, more significant.
Yeah, deeper you might not notice a seasonal signal at all. It might get sort of just kind of diluted, you know, if you're going down 200 or 300 feet, and you just won't notice a seasonal change at all. Yeah.
Just within a range.
Yeah. So this is what I'll say. I've looked at maybe 70 well logs of our 9,000 wells, and they were 75 to 225 feet. That was from a study that we did over the last 2 years in the county where we did some testing. Our well logs, though, are not, we don't have a well log database at the health department, and it's not computerized, so there's no good way to see what are all the well depths across the county. There's not an easy way to do that right now. Yeah. Let me see if there's anything else I want to talk about this. I don't think so, so we can go to the next one. All right, so just another touch on a groundwater quality factor that we look at specifically at the health department quite frequently is bacteria, as I mentioned. So this is total coliform bacteria. It gives an indication that there's been some sort of sewage waste that has come into contact with that drinking water. Usually we see it when the well is in poor condition. If there's been some maintenance issues or some upkeep issues, then we'll see that. And it's definitely not been as widespread as nitrate, for example. And other potential contaminants, you know, anything that could be in our wells is anything that has been applied to the surface. So road salt is something that has been studied and found. Pesticides, obviously fertilizers, as we've talked about. Anything that enters a septic system, so septic systems can and do leak. So think pharmaceuticals, laundry detergent, caffeine, those sorts of things have been found in groundwater in other parts of the state. Things like caffeine and pharmaceuticals have been found at very low levels in wells here in the county from that testing study that I mentioned just a little bit ago. So those are the types of things, like when we think about what could go into groundwater, we have to think about, well, what are we putting close enough? What are we putting on the surface, or what are we putting closer to groundwater that could potentially be leaking? But of course, as far as one of our unknowns then is, well, what are all of the things that could be potentially in groundwater, and how widespread are those? And it's really hard to start to get a grip on that, because we put a lot of stuff in our septic systems, and we put a lot of stuff on the land surface, and so it's hard to start getting a grip on some of those things just offhand. A little bit then more about groundwater quality. There we go. Or sorry, quantity. So this is a map from 2016 of just to give a breakdown of the high capacity wells. So specifically those wells that are at that pump at 70 gallons per minute or more. That's a high capacity well. Those are not the wells that we have in our homes. Generally those would serve the city, they would serve an industry, they would serve a very large business. Irrigation wells, they kind of meet that category of high capacity wells there. So you'll see the biggest chunk then of our high capacity well use is for public and domestic water use, so about 42% there. Again, serving our municipalities. The next largest one then is that non-agricultural irrigation, so 24% there. And don't exactly, maybe Greg knows what falls into non-agricultural irrigation. Do you know?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. Oh, golf courses. There we go. That makes sense. Thanks, Matt. And then agricultural use, agriculture, irrigation, industrial, and commercial is actually a very small amount of total groundwater use. And so just for comparison, I think high capacity wells sometimes become a buzzword especially with industry. So in our county, we've got 149 high capacity wells. Again, that's water for about 75,000 people, plus golf courses and agriculture and other industry. And then about 9,000 kind of low flow, or some of those private wells that would just serve a typical home outside of the city limits. I think that's it. There's no questions. So another thing that our report touches on, which was not discussed at all in the report from 25 years ago, is climate change, of course. And so what can we expect in Eau Claire County when it comes to climate change are first a few of the questions to answer. So an increase of average temperature is one thing that has been sort of predicted for our part of the state. So an annual average increase of about 6.5 degrees Fahrenheit. An increase of those extreme heat events, so more heat waves, if you will, and then an increase in annual precipitation, but a change in how that precipitation comes. So we'll get more precipitation overall, but it'll kind of come in more intense storms rather than spread out more evenly. So, but an overall increase average of about 1.5 inches of precipitation. And then 1 to 2 drought years are still expected, even with that increase in annual precipitation about every 10 years, 1 or 2 drought years within there. So groundwater and surface water, water quality and quantity are of course closely linked to each other, but they're also closely linked to local and regional climate conditions. So when we think about what the future of our groundwater protection needs or warrants, we have to also be thinking about, well, where are we getting that water from, the rain, and how are we going to be using that water differently based on these temperature changes or based on the intensity of our rainstorms here as well. So for example, more recharge could be an improvement for our overall groundwater levels, but if we're having increased temperatures, we might also need to be irrigating more. We'll be watering our golf courses and lawns and gardens more. And we also may have a longer growing season, so our need, the amount of time that we need that higher volume of water could be extended as well. And depending on the severity of climate change, we might change our land use. We might change the types of crops or our crop cycling or other applications to the land surface, such as road salt. If we have a little bit warmer temperatures and we have more ice than snow, we could be applying more road salt than we do right now. So overall, it's still a little uncertain, obviously, about how exactly climate change will be realized here in the next 5, 10, or 20 years. But something that we're trying to keep in the back of our minds as we're thinking about what the future of our groundwater resources look like. So some recommendations then that came out of the report I will touch on. We had them into 3 general categories of quality, quantity, and education. So I'll talk through each of those next. So as far as our groundwater quality recommendations, we, and when I say we, the Groundwater Advisory Committee, along with the staff that assisted that committee in putting together this report, so that's the big W, we, I guess. So systematically continue well testing. Like I said, we have a really good sample size when it comes to nitrate. We've got about half the wells tested. We don't have as really good sample size for some other potential contaminants or health concerns. So continuing to understand what questions do we need to answer, and sampling not only for the protection of human health, but also for the understanding of our groundwater quality and how it relates to our resource as a whole will be important. We discussed defining and mapping groundwater environmentally sensitive areas. I apologize for the spelling error there, which I've just noticed. And then review existing ordinances and regulations. So related to industry, related to agriculture, related to subdivision, thinking about whether or not our ordinances are protective of our groundwater for each of those areas.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Before I leave this slide?
Yes.
On that second one, did you talk about doing anything special in the wellhead protection areas around municipalities? Those are mapped sensitive areas. They're already mapped.
Yeah.
Wondering if you got into recommending anything special in those areas.
Go ahead.
Within our discussions with groundwater plan, those areas are currently regulated underneath DNR regulations as far as what are allowable uses, which have been adopted into our county zoning code for the wellhead protection, and the municipalities, such as the village of Fall Creek, has already incorporated that within their wellhead protection plan as part of their municipal permit process. So that portion, the Groundwater Advisory Committee did not delve into deeply, so that's already fairly well defined.
You know if there's anything in there about ag lands? Well, let's say that ag land, a field in a wellhead protection area should have a nutrient management plan.
Yes, that's part of it.
Okay.
Yes. That's existing already.
All right.
Thanks.
If I don't go through the city county health department to test
Mhm.
my well, does the department still get that information?
We do not. No. If you take your lab sample to Colfax, which a number of people do, we do not have a way to get that right now. A lot of real estate transactions where well water is tested, if that doesn't come to us, we don't get that data. That's a gap we're trying to work on, because obviously there's a lot more data out there, and it's a work in progress to get that.
Nutritionist test our water, and she came with a sample bottle and it went somewhere.
Sure.
We got a report back, but
Yeah.
any of that information.
No, if your letterhead didn't have the health department logo on it, we didn't test it, and we don't have it. So you're all encouraged to bring your well samples to the health department for multiple reasons.
If I may add on to that point, I sit on a statewide group of land conservation and public health people from across the state. And this is a problem we realize across the state.
Yeah.
We're trying to find a way for us to bring all this information together. From the public health labs, the private labs, try to bring those things together. It's challenging, but we're exploring options.
Other questions about our quality recommendations? Okay. So then quantity recommendations, one which we're already obviously in the process of is updating the existing animal waste storage ordinance. Another, this is not a small lift, is that we've recommended is a comprehensive countywide groundwater flow model. And essentially what that would do is give us a computer program that would understand, if you can picture kind of what our county would look like as a 3D, if you could pick it up and look at our county as a 3D box, it would help us to understand how thick is that groundwater, so how much groundwater do we have, where do we have more, where do we have less thickness of groundwater, where is it flowing to on sort of a big scale across the county, but on smaller scales, in between drainages and things like that. And then what happens if we change the precipitation this much, or if we put in this many more wells, or if we change our crop types to 50% of something else. So it helps us to understand that whole water system of what's going in, what's coming out, how does it move, and how will it change if we introduce some change to the landscape, some change to the land use, some change to precipitation or temperature. So a groundwater flow model is very, very powerful. They're also very, very expensive and complicated to put together. And so while it would be helpful for us to answer lots of questions, it's sort of a high reach that needs some funding and needs some expertise. And as a committee, we've talked about it for a number of months, if not over a year, about working on pursuing this. And so that's sort of something that continues to be in process. And then finally, our last quantity recommendation is to review the existing ordinances and regulations again as it relates to our different land uses and try to get an idea whether or not they are protective, and if so, how, and if not, how they could be modified reasonably. So, yes.
Yeah, I have a question. Maybe we show this, but there was a map in that report. It's soils of Eau Claire County, Wisconsin, and their ability to attenuate contaminants. And that, I think, is a really essential map for us who are working with this issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Tables and the amount of manure that's been spread in. They know where the sand is, you know, what kind of soils we have, and that are the most likely to be have the highest risk.
Mm-hmm.
And then those that are have less of a risk. So
Yeah.
it's not just your groundwater and your quality, but it's soils that we have that allow those contaminants to get down into the plant.
Yeah, certainly. It's one big complicated relationship. It's really what it is. Yeah.
Maybe you
I-
can get through
I-
and see
I-
you're
yeah.
showing a map there.
Yeah,
This
and
one is figure 3. And
Mhm.
it's the, of course, I don't have a color
Yeah.
printer, so it doesn't
Mhm.
really.
And it would be hard. I did not put it in the presentation because that map is also hard to show on a projector. But yeah, I'll give directions to how to get to that groundwater report so you can pull it up yourselves.
Well, there's got to be a colored map someplace.
Yeah, so a lot of those maps, and that one I'm not. Are you familiar with that map?
Yes, that one was
Okay.
put out by extension
Okay.
back in the 1990s. I think we
Mhm.
have one color version. Back
Do you?
in the-
I'd like to see it because it's
Yeah, yes, soils are important. Two soils of the same riskiness, one of which is having things applied to it, one of which is not, then they do different things to groundwater then. Or is two the same, you have the same soil type, but groundwater is 100 feet deep and groundwater is 25 feet deep, will have different impacts to groundwater. So certainly a very important part of that equation, but just a part of the overall equation. Yeah.
They have so much contaminated. They have so many contaminated
Mhm.
wells.
Mhm.
They're talking about how even with nutrient management plans, they're not working. They're not working because they have excessive rainfall, and then the other part of the picture is the irrigation wells.
Yeah.
And that just takes those nitrates and contaminants right down into the groundwater. And so that's why I was curious here, because
Yeah.
it seems to me, because the soil around my house is all sand,
Mhm.
and we have a lot of sand.
We do have quite a lot of sand. Yeah.
And I would like to see exactly where that is and where the adequate soil is, and to keep those pollutants from getting down into the ground.
Yeah, certainly an important part of the equation there. What I am showing is, so I just mentioned what a groundwater flow model could do. This is our existing groundwater flow data. I think it's from the early 90s, and it's basically a generalized map of estimated groundwater elevations with arrows that show high to low. So this doesn't really answer too many of those questions about our future use or what happens when we change our use. So just to give you an idea of the information we have right now when it comes to groundwater flow and groundwater quantity, and the potential for better information for groundwater flow and groundwater quantity. So that was just an illustration of that point here. So our final bit of recommendations then around groundwater education. So building a more robust web presence for folks to understand here in Eau Claire County, well, general groundwater principles, but then also what we know about groundwater here in Eau Claire County. Working more closely with home buyers, home builders, and realtors to make sure everybody's on the same page about what it takes to not only maintain a private well for health and safety, but also kind of maintain that private acreage, if you will, for protection of groundwater, especially when it comes to applying things to the land, when it comes to septic maintenance, and everything that's related there. We'd like to build a platform to share our local testing results on the web, so we can make those more visible to folks without drilling down to a specific house per se, but a little bit better than the map I was able to show here. And of course, understand more or have access to more of that data that comes from Eau Claire County, but we don't have at the health department. and then increase our partnership with towns, villages, and other municipalities so that this really becomes a coordinated effort for improving public understanding of our groundwater resource. So a very general timeline. This was shared with the county board after the groundwater report was finished. So when it comes to groundwater quantity goals, those are along the top there. So early on, look for some funding for that groundwater flow model. Next year, thinking about reviewing existing regulations. Hopefully a year after that, completing a groundwater flow model if we could find some funding and expertise that was available. And then explore our regulations and understand and decide whether or not there's more protective measures that can be taken. And then, yeah, if you could advance one more. So our quality goals then at the bottom. So updating the animal waste storage ordinance as we're doing right now. Review other existing regulations, more testing and defining of that groundwater environmentally sensitive areas. And then again, exploring if more protective regulations are needed, and if so, how. Did you have a question, Kate, before we move on?
So did you say that the health department is owning these kind of with the direction of the county board, or who is going to be taking on doing these specific steps?
The Groundwater Advisory Committee owns them, is the owner, yeah.
And staff from public health, land conservation, planning and development, regional planning,
DNR, and university. Yep.
University are all partners with the groundwater advisory.
I just drew the short straw to present today.
So portions of this come to land conservation, animal waste ordinance, but there's other portions which may go somewhere else.
Testing would come to the health department.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
The comprehensive countywide groundwater flow model, is there any other counties around us or in our state that have done that?
Chippewa has, I don't know if they're currently working on or have completed one, but they're the closest to us that has anything like what would be helpful to us. Yeah, this is not a brand new thing. You just need the money, and
Who actually does it?
in Chippewa County, they worked with the Wisconsin Geological and Natural History Survey. They have folks that are experts in groundwater modeling and the computer software it takes to be able to put that together. But you need money to collect some real data as well. You need to kind of ground truth what your current elevations of groundwater are to put into the model. So it's not just somebody sitting behind a computer, but you need to go out and collect some real data as well. So it becomes time consuming and expensive in that way.
There is right now a big effort in the Central Sands area because of water withdrawals and the interactions of the groundwater and surface water. They have a groundwater study going on right now to try to develop their computer model in that area in the Central Sands.
So like Chippewa County, theirs, did they access grant money to do that, or how do they?
Do you remember where they got their money from?
They got some money through grants, and they also acquired some money through sand mines. Theirs is not a total comprehensive study. It focused on the interactions of some of the surface water and the sand mining activity and groundwater. We are looking at the Chippewa County model when it was developed such that it could be applied outside of Chippewa County. We're looking to maybe extrapolate what they started as an option to build into Eau Claire County.
Good question. Okay, last slide then is just to give pointers on where to find this great report. If you're interested in looking at some of those figures.
If I may.
Yes.
The report link should have went out with the agenda.
That's right, it did.
Did everyone get that?
Okay, excellent. If not, Eau Claire County website, you can search for State of Groundwater on the website, and then it will be your first, the first thing that pops up from there as well. So that's all I had. Are there any other questions?
How much money did one of them studies cost? Get that flow study.
$500,000.
500,000 would do it, huh?
We'll start in that neighborhood. We're not sure,
Okay.
but we're looking at that type of money. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to discuss the report.